Welcome to RHI's Sociable City Interviews, where we meet with global thought leaders on nightlife and the social economy. Today, we are honored to be with Darrel Stephens, co-director of the Policing, Security Technology, and Private Security Research and Policy Institute at Florida State University, and former executive director, Major Cities Chiefs Association.
Hey, Darrel, it's great to talk to you. I'm honored to be able to have this conversation and look forward to it.
Thanks, Jim. It's good to be here. I appreciate the invitation, and always nice to have an opportunity to talk to you about the important issues of nightlife that you're working on.
Okay, good. Now, I know you have a long career, and I think you began when I graduated high school, but can you explain a little bit of your history and how you've seen it evolve over the years?
I started my career in policing in 1968 in Kansas City, Missouri, as a police officer. I got promoted a couple of times, but had some experiences there that took my career path a different way than many others in my field did. I left there and served as an assistant chief and a police chief in a couple of different communities. Then I spent 6 years as executive director of the Police Executive Research Forum, back as a police chief for about 12 years that time, St. Petersburg and Charlotte-Mecklenburg. And then when I retired from there, went back to the Major City Chiefs Association as the executive director.
Yeah, I think that's when I met you. And one of the things I learned about you many years later was just how influential you were in the early days of research on evidence-based policing, and in particular the SARA model. And so it seems that's something that you kind of were involved with. But when you began to put the pieces together, I know when I first learned about the SARA model, and we had a couple of case studies of it, it was like, oh, wow, this makes a lot of sense. But obviously up until that point, that idea of looking at the larger environment rather than looking at particular incidents, that must have been an aha moment for those of you that those are the people that you were working with. How did that all fit together in your mind, that kind of revelation?
Jim, that's kind of a evolution over time. There were a number of aha moments along the way. My introduction to evidence-based thinking was as a police officer in Kansas City, working on some of the groundbreaking experiments that were conducted in the early 1970s. I was involved with one of them, but that exposure and that experience caused me to think about policing differently, caused me to ask questions that were just assumptions before. I assumed that our approach to policing, basically preventive patrol, arresting people, rapid response, investigations, were effective strategies. Turns out the research said that their effectiveness was not nearly as great as what we imagined it to be. So if what you're doing doesn't work, what should you be doing? And we began, not just me, other people that I worked with over the years, we began thinking about different ways to police. We learned from scholars such as Herman Goldstein, a giant in our field who created problem-oriented policing. And I was involved in trying those ideas out. Newport News, Virginia was where the SARA model was actually developed. I didn't develop it. The team that we had working on that project developed it. And we tried those things, and we continued to evolve and continued to experiment with them. And as new ideas helped us with that, it grew into more of a larger strategy for policing. And I think an effective strategy, even though a lot of places have gotten away from it.
Well, I became familiar with it, as you may recall, when President Clinton, put in the whole community policing model, hiring 100,000 officers, setting up the regional community policing training centers, which is where I learned more about it in San Diego, and then also the Community Policing Consortium that brought together the key police associations. So that was part of that evolution, I would suspect, that you now took the SARA model, that approach of evidence-based thinking, and began to look at how to incorporate that into a redefining the role of the police officer and its engagement with the community. You see that as an evolutionary part of it?
Absolutely. It was very much a part of the evolution. Newport News, our work there was in from about 1984, 86. Then I went to Perf and we promoted the idea of probable-oriented policing. By the time the crime bill in 1994 was passed, which provided the resources for community policing and problem solving for and the 100,000 police officers, there was a pretty good base of knowledge that could that money could be invested in to help drive the crime rate down. Community policing was a pretty ill-defined concept, and it meant different things to different people at that time. But through the work, community policing and problem solving basically became matched up. It was just engaging people in the community to solve problems. And so there's the idea of community engagement, working with stakeholders, listening to people, had its greatest impact when you did that in the context of a problem that was of concern to both the community and the police, who could work together to develop solutions for that. And not all of them involved a criminal justice approach.
Going on in history, after 9/11, there was a big shift, particularly the anti-terrorism shift in policing, which more or less led to some militarization of police versus that community-oriented policing model. And then later on, when we saw some of the riots that were happening, racial justice riots that were happening, President Obama created the 21st Century Policing Task Force, and you were a part of that in terms of a technical advisor. So from that point on, I mean, you've seen this evolution of policing, and then that report came out, and it had some really interesting philosophies in it that were kind of working to shift some of this kind of anti-terrorism approach to getting back to some of what was referred to, I believe, in the report, the Guardian approach to policing. So how did that 21st Century Task Force, contribute to the knowledge around policing, and what has taken hold, and what do you wish could have been followed through on?
Some of the recommendations of the task force have, in fact, taken hold around the country. But before speaking to that, I think, as you point out, the focus on terrorism did create a shift in policing, pushed us away from the community engagement that we were doing. But at the same time, the technological improvements, the ability to analyze, the ability to gain actionable intelligence, put the police in a position where they didn't have to engage the community as much as they did before to work on these problems. They could get fairly predictive in terms of where crime was going to take place, and so they responded with their presence and aggressive policing rather than responding to collaborate with people in the community to solve those problems. So the President's Task Force forces us or pushes us back towards community engagement. It had 6 pillars. Trust and legitimacy was the first pillar, and we saw there was one on training, officer wellness, policy, oversight. So we've seen recommendations out of there. We've seen police responding by doing training on procedural justice, de-escalation types of training were influenced. One of the biggest changes that we've seen is in the investigation of officer-involved shootings. One of the key recommendations the task force made was that there should be independent investigations. The departments shouldn't investigate themselves alone. And so we've seen a lot of states take over those investigations. We've seen other prosecuting attorneys and other models that that make those investigations much more credible because they're not totally being driven by the agency itself.
Mhm, mhm. So now, since you've left the major cities chiefs, you've taken a position at Florida University, right? Florida State University.
I have. I'm co-director of the Policing, Security Technology, and Private Security Research Policy Institute. It's once in part of a center from the College of Criminology and Criminal Justice. And so we've been working on that now for about 7 or 8 months.
Well, in nightlife, which you've been a part of, as we've been doing these annual summits in the beginning, and really an influential person in helping to move us forward on this theme. We've begun to see challenges in nightlife areas relative to security and safety, and that the security people at the door obviously have a role to play. But some of what would be considered kind of the management of the street crowd, keeping people moving, trying to address disorder. In some cases, in communities like in West Palm Beach, they see that as something that private security, not just your kind of daytime ambassador person, but I know in West Palm Beach, they recruit former law enforcement personnel who have experience and have direct communication with the police, where the private security that monitors the street activity can deal with, crowd congestion and, the disorder. And then the police are freer to patrol the areas where the crime is happening, on the side streets, and then also be responsive. So now that you're looking at both private security and policing, do you see this as a potential model as more and more police departments are challenged with having enough officers, that you're going to see a shift to some form of private security that will be working in the nightlife districts to do activities that don't require, as I say, the guns and badges, but really are much more capable of conflict resolution, but not necessarily having to have that dedicated officer?
I absolutely do. Actually, I think that has been evolving as well over the years, but it's going to get a bigger push going forward because police can't hire. They're having a difficult time filling the positions that they have. There's some things that the police have historically done that they don't do anymore because they don't have the resources to be able to respond. So from that perspective, other people are going to have to step in and provide those services. And private security has done that, and they've done that very well in many instances. It's just a redefining of their responsibilities. We've seen private security faces some of the same challenges, however, in hiring as what police do. So there's more and more focus on how to keep people safe and secure, create an environment where people feel comfortable. There's a lot more emphasis being placed on collaboration between police and private security, a lot more emphasis being placed on the use of technology in trying to do that same thing.
That, for instance, you now see more of the venue operators using technology and identification, ID scanning. And then in some cases, these systems are interconnected so that if a person is a problematic patron in one place, the other venues can be notified if they try to get in because of the ID scanning system. And then also now you're seeing more introduction of metal scanning devices.
Right.
And in some cases, those metal scanning devices are connected to the ID scanning. I know in Sacramento, where they just recently had that major shooting, all of the nightlife venues use an ID scanning system, and it was possible for the police to more quickly identify individuals that may have been involved in the shooting just by being able to access some of those records. But you were talking earlier before we started this call about the concept of robotics, that some of the basic tasks of a security person at the door could be replicated by robotics, which is a kind of a revolutionary idea, and that would be an interesting evolution. Naturally, they're not going to be patrolling the interior of the venue, looking for people who are intoxicated or seeing potential conflicts, but at least the basic entry point might be a robotic function. Can you explain that?
Sure. As we've seen the progression of robotics move very rapidly over the past 10, 15 years. We've seen, actually, there are places around the world and in this country where they have robots that perform the patrolling function, where they're out in a space that where people come together and they're patrolling. They've got cameras and sound, and you can even talk to them. And so they're much more visible in that space today. I even think that some of that identification function at the front door could easily be done by robotics. They've got cameras, they've got speakers, you can talk to them, and I think it's a pretty routinized task. And if you run into a problem, the robot can summon a human to come and help deal with whatever the issues is there. I think a big challenge for us in the entertainment world, nightlife world going forward, is managing the violence. Violence has skyrocketed in the past couple of years all across the country in the urban areas. Nightlife venues bring people together. There's alcohol. There's opportunities for not clear thinking when you've had a couple of drinks or so, and then our gun policy allows people to carry guns in a way that used to be not possible. So I think that's a big issue for us, and I think as well, robotics can help us with that as well. They can see things. And as the artificial intelligence improves, I think that will be a key source of summoning the physical police or a person, a security guard, to help resolve an issue.
Yeah, this was probably around 7 or 8 years ago when I was in Amsterdam. They were doing a pilot, which included lighting and sound monitoring, so that they had cameras and they had sound monitoring, so that as the district itself began to get more populated and there were more people, or if there were incidents, the cameras would be able to detect that. And then if an incident occurred, they were able to turn up the lights and make it so that it kind of dispersed the crowd. So it was a very elementary way, I think, of what you were talking about, but it was a way to, like the shot spotter technology, so, right. But it was integrating the sound and the crowds and the lighting, so that when an incident occurred, lighting, if you take a dark area and light it up really quickly, totally changed people's behavior, kind of wakes them up. So I thought that was interesting, but I guess that's kind of similar to what you're talking about. It's using the monitoring devices to be able to count people on the street and listen to sound and see where there's an acceleration of conflict.
Even if they just serve in a role of a camera, where they're able to visualize people and see them. There's algorithms that a central monitoring station, they can pick up anomalies that's been programmed in the algorithms that would cause you to want to focus more attention on that, to see if there was something that needed the attention of a real person.
Yeah, that's interesting, because when I worked in Minneapolis, they have a very sophisticated street camera system, and there was a shooting incident, and so we were able to watch retroactively the behavior of the shooter. And it was, to me, it seemed a little odd, but he was a man who wore a red hoodie, and he was constantly walking around the street, and he seemed to be, had a purpose in his movements. And just the behavior that he had, really, you could see how it evolved to the point where, even though it was closing time, there were police officers, foot officers on the sidewalks. There was a row of bike officers. I think they had 11 bike officers and 4 mounted police officers. And that was the view of the camera. You were looking down at all these police, and you saw this person in a red hoodie walk around the corner and then start shooting, which made no sense to me, because he obviously didn't see anything other than what he was looking for. But in retrospect, perhaps a camera and artificial intelligence could have been monitoring this person's behavior as being,
right,
symptomatic of somebody who's on the prowl, versus just people walking up and down the street. So is that what you're talking about?
That's exactly what I'm talking about, and that has developed pretty well over the years. Like your camera's catching someone at a bus stop that goes by, sits there for a second, gets up and leaves a package or a briefcase there. Is that a suspicious activity? Is that something that requires investigation? That's something that the cameras would pick up and alert
be able to do that. Yeah. Well, I'm going to get into a tough conversation here. When you see nightlife evolving and you see cities trying to fix it, there's several approaches they take. One is they basically let nightclubs hire police officers off duty. I know when we worked in one city or a couple of cities, those officers were allowed to be paid in cash. They didn't even have to get a check. And then you have just the infusion of more police. And then you have kind of like the Chicago and DC and Edmonton models of kind of a dedicated trained unit of police, where the officers are oriented to the special circumstances of nightlife. They're assigned as a shift rather than overtime. And so you have this continuum from letting police officers work in bars, basically outside the door and just being in uniform as a presence, to more of a roaming police. And it seems to me like the evolution of this beyond even the dedicated police officer would be better trained private security that would take on some of those responsibilities, as well as the use of technology. So do you see this as the continuum of managing nightlife, from
I do.
police officers working in bars to dedicated officers who are properly trained, supported by technology?
Yeah, I definitely see a growing role for private security in providing the basic security measures and taking the basic steps in and around our nightlife venues. One challenge is that you're not going to be able to get off-duty officers anymore. They're working mandatory overtime for the communities that they serve, and so their appetite for working even more beyond that is down considerably. In fact, there's a lot of places around the country where there's off-duty officer jobs that just aren't filled. They go unfilled because they can't hire them. So private security's got to take on that role. Private security also has to be supplemented with the kind of technology that we've been talking about, because they face some of the same challenges. I've never thought it was a good idea for off-duty officers to work in bars. It's not a place where we should have them. And so I was in Charlotte. We created a nightlife district unit that had several officers. They received training. They developed relationships. They went in and out of the bars, but they worked for the police department. They worked for the community. They didn't work for the bars themselves. And so I've always discouraged police officers from working at those institutions.
Well, this has been a great conversation, Darrel. Boy, oh boy, you're just a wealth of information and also innovation. I mean, the thing is that collectively, as people get older, we can accumulate all of these experiences and look back and say, well, that worked and that didn't work. Let's put the things together that work. but also you're progressive in thinking about the technology and how that's all going to integrate with the future of policing, as much as it has. So any kind of futuristic prediction, like, in a year and a half from now, as we see society evolving and these policing changes occurring, how do you think it's going to change or impact how people go out at night?
Well, my hope is that as the technology and the partnerships between policing and private security improve, and they work together more strategically on providing security to these locations where they overlap, is that they're going to create an environment where people have the confidence that they can go and enjoy their evening without the threat of violence. And I think we're going to evolve to that. It's just going to take a little longer.
All right. Well, this has been great, Darrel. We'll chat a minute after this, but what an interesting perspective that you bring. That's something I've never thought about. So I appreciate your time.
Thank you.